Thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring this video, more on them later. Flying over Karachi, Pakistan's most populous city, an Airbus A320 is struggling to maintain altitude. Its engines have stopped working and the plane is descending fast towards a populated area. What happened here, and will the plane make it to a runway? Find out with me today as we take a look at the incomprehensible crash of Pakistan International Airlines Flight A303. Welcome to Airspace. Pakistan International Airlines Flight A303 departed Lahore on May 22, 2020 for a domestic flight to Karachi. The 90-minute flight was piloted by Senior Captain Sajjad Gul and First Officer Usman Azam. In the cabin of the Airbus A320, 6 flight attendants catered for the needs of the 91 passengers on that day. Until the approach in Karachi, the flight was entirely uneventful. At the top of descent, the pilots planned to approach Karachi on an arrival route called Nawab Shah 2 Alpha, followed by an instrument landing system approach to runway 25 left. A pretty straightforward procedure that looks like this. But soon after they passed the first point in their route, air traffic control cleared the flight direct to waypoint Makli, which shortened the approach path of the flight by quite a bit. A welcome surprise, usually. In the cockpit, however, the mood was not as great. In May 2020, the world suffered the fears and consequences of a new pandemic and everything it brought with it. The two pilots were preoccupied with the discussion about COVID and its impact on their families. Probably, the discussion was so intense that the pilots missed the fact that their selected rate of descent was entirely insufficient for the now shortened approach path they were given. When they crossed the waypoint Makli, they should have been at an altitude of about 5,000 feet to achieve a nice 3-degree approach angle. Flight A303, however, found itself at an altitude of almost double that, 9,800 feet to be precise. The plane was also still going fast at 245 knots. At this point, a stabilized approach would have been difficult to achieve, but not impossible with correct and prompt intervention. But the pilots continued their approach with a shallow descent until they finally realized at a point about 12 nautical miles from the runway that they were coming in way too high. In an attempt to lose altitude fast, the pilots reduced engine thrust to idle and extended the speed brakes on top of the wings. Now, the A320 descended at a high rate of descent, but it was also approaching the runway very fast. To provide even more drag and therefore an even greater rate of descent, the pilots lowered the landing gear. In the approach control center, the air traffic controller that handled Flight A303 saw that it was coming in way too high and fast and decided to politely intervene by asking the crew how many miles they would prefer to fly until touchdown. This gave the crew the opportunity to ask for an extended approach path to reduce their altitude and therefore their chance for a successful landing. The pilots, however, did not take this chance and just replied by saying that they were very comfortable with the available track, even though they were pretty much coming in hot. The controller tried again by saying, "Sir, an orbit is available." An orbit is just a 360 degrees turn. This would have allowed the crew to lower their altitude substantially, but the controller was ignored by the crew once again. Later on, he ordered the crew twice to fly an orbit, but the pilots just replied that they were able to make it. They continued the approach at high speed with a high rate of descent. Finally, at a point 5 nautical miles from the runway, the crew intercepted the correct glide slope, which leads to runway 25 left. At the same time though, the overspeed warning sounded as the A320 barreled down the glide slope at over 250 knots, which way exceeds the limit speed for both the flaps and the slats. At this point, the two pilots did something inexplicable. They retracted the landing gear of the A320 just 4.5 miles before touchdown. With haste, they also extended the flaps to position 3, despite being way too fast to do that at the moment. The overspeed warning continued to sound. It can be clearly heard in the background as the pilots accepted their landing clearance by the approach controller. Listen for yourself. And yes, you heard correctly. The landing clearance was given to the flight not by the tower controller, but by the approach controller. As the approach controller realized that the aircraft was hurrying in for a landing, he decided not to trouble the pilots with an additional frequency change and called his colleague in the tower to obtain and relay a landing clearance to the pilots. Finally, Flight A303 reached runway 25 left at the correct glide angle, but it was coming in too fast at about 160 instead of 140 knots. The pilots performed a flare, that is the part where they lift the nose of the plane ever so slightly to reduce the rate of descent to a minimum to provide a smooth touchdown. Moments later, the plane touched down, the pilots applied reverse thrust and provided a braking input on the rudder pedals as they always would during landing. But instead of slowing down nicely, the plane made terrible grinding noises. Inexplicably, the pilots had continued their approach after retracting the landing gear without ever lowering it again. Now, the A320 slipped down the runway while making contact with the surface with both engine pods and its tail. Startled, the pilots applied full power and lifted the plane back into the sky. Miraculously, the engine still managed to deliver high thrust, despite being banged onto the runway just seconds ago. Now, the A320 climbed back into the sky, while pilots asked air traffic control to once again approach runway 25 left. They turned the plane around onto a downwind heading, but soon, the battered engines started to fail one by one. After the second engine had failed, the ram air turbine deployed, a small propeller that is turned by the airstream as long as the plane flies above a certain speed. It provides emergency hydraulic and electric power so that the flight controls and some systems still work to keep the plane airborne and controllable. On this picture of flight A303, you can see it right here. Also, note the very distinguishable scrape marks on the engines. The approach controller ordered the plane to maintain 3,000 feet, but soon the captain said that they were already at 2,000 feet and losing altitude. Desperately, the pilots tried to extend their glide to reach the runway. For a while, it looked like they were going to make it, but eventually, they were just too low and too slow. The Airbus A320 crashed into a residential area called Model Colony, just 1,340 meters short of runway 25 left. Had it managed to fly for just 300 more meters, it would have crashed onto a sandy plain, avoiding all the houses. Maybe the pilots would even have been able to keep the plane somewhat intact. But alas, this was not the case. The plane hit several residential buildings and set the surrounding environment ablaze. Out of the 99 people on board the plane, 97 perished, including all crew members. On the ground, miraculously only 4 people were injured. One of the injured later perished in the hospital, unfortunately. The crash found itself in the spotlight of a lot of media attention and speculation. Had this aircraft crashed because of a technical difficulty, because of pilot error, or had there been something else at play entirely? Let's take a look at what we know so far. There are some very interesting facts and developments that came to light in the aftermath of the crash. Theory number 1, a technical malfunction. When we take a look at the maintenance records of the accident aircraft, we quickly see that it had been grounded for a while, 46 days to be precise. But this was not due to technical difficulties, but rather because of a lack of demand for flights due to the pandemic. The aircraft had been put back into service on May 6th, so roughly 2 weeks before the crash. It had been used on 6 flights since, without incident. Also, the fact that the pilots were able to extend and later retract the landing gear normally indicated that it probably had worked normally before their first touchdown. But had the runway scrape maybe damaged the landing gear mechanism? Looking at the video footage of the crash and by analyzing the wreckage, investigators were able to tell that the landing gear had been extended once again while the plane was on downwind while the engines were failing. The freefall extension mechanism of the landing gear had not been used, so it must have extended as per design. A mechanical difficulty before the first touchdown also seems unlikely, since the pilots maintained routine communications all the way. Theory number 2, malicious intent by the pilots. I think this one can be ruled out fairly easily. If the pilots had intended to crash the plane, they could have just done so without going through the extra steps of crashing it onto a runway and going around first. Malicious intent on this one seems unlikely to me. Speaking of malicious intent, do you know where that could be much more likely? On the internet. Have you ever browsed the web while sitting in your favorite cafe with an open Wi-Fi and thought to yourself, who else might be looking at the cat memes I'm browsing right now? In all seriousness though, threats to cybersecurity are more common than you think. I personally had my password to my Spotify account stolen a while ago, and all my playlists were replaced by hip-hop music and the best of Taylor Swift playlist. Yeah, that was a minor disaster. To help you avoid the same trouble, allow me to present today's sponsor, NordVPN. NordVPN helps you to keep your internet traffic private and also offers many cool and useful features, such as phishing protection, which should help you avoid websites that try to steal your precious passwords. NordVPN threat protection also helps to keep those pesky trackers and intrusive ads away from your devices, regardless of whether you are currently connected to a VPN or not. So stay safe! Go to nordvpn.com/airspace to get a huge discount off the 2-year plan with 4 additional months for free. Try NordVPN risk-free thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/airspace. Now let's get back to the story. Theory number 3. Pilot error. When investigators scoured the wreckage to find the cockpit voice and flight data recorders, they soon were able to find them. A lead investigator took them to France to have them read out by a specialist team at the BEA, the French Air Accident Investigation branch, which has a lot of expertise with these recorders. Despite the charred state of the recorders, both were able to be read out fairly easily. What investigators found was very concerning. During the entire flight, the 2 pilots had not adhered to standard procedures and callouts, and they did not follow basic crew resource management. Instead, the pair was engaged in a heated discussion about COVID and its impact on them, since both had family members who had been affected. Is it possible that these 2 pilots were so distracted that they committed such grave and basic mistakes? It surely seems possible. As the pilots approached the airport, their workload must have increased more and more as the aircraft became ever higher on the approach path. Instead of going around, they just tried to get the plane on the ground at all costs for no reason whatsoever. They could have just accepted the controller's offer to fly additional miles to reduce their altitude, but they seemed so focused on their approach that they essentially became passengers on their own flight. One theory might be that the crew retracted the landing gear when the first overspeed warning sounded, in an effort to limit the maximum speed exceedance on the landing gear. However, the overspeed warning never stopped after that, since the plane was flying too fast for their selected flap configuration at the time. According to the recorders, several warnings such as overspeed, landing gear not down, and ground proximity warning alerts sounded continuously during the last part of the first approach. Maybe the pilots overlooked the fact that the landing gear was not down in the pandemonium of red and loud warnings. This theory would be confirmed by the fact that the pilots actually tried to land the plane without the landing gear down, and that they tried to apply the brakes after touchdown, even though the gear was still up. After the crash, Pakistan International Airlines took a close look at its pilots and their qualifications. What they discovered was, quite frankly, shocking. Out of the 434 pilots employed by the airline, 150 were immediately and indefinitely grounded for holding either bogus or suspicious licenses. 5 days later, the airline was banned from flying to the European Union and the United Kingdom. Shortly after, the United States also put the airline on a blacklist. The scandal about the pilot's licenses soon spread throughout Pakistan and led to a greater inquiry. It was subsequently found that out of the country's 860 active pilots, 260 had suspicious licenses. After taking a closer look, 50 of these were found to be actually fraudulent. They were cancelled with immediate effect. So, what was the true cause of this accident? How did a captain with an experience of over 18,000 flight hours fly a presumably perfectly intact aircraft into a runway without lowering the landing gear first? Was this a case of a huge human performance impairment due to personal issues, or were these pilots just incompetent because they held fake licenses? I guess we will have to wait for the final report to get an answer to all these questions. What do you think is the most likely cause for this accident? Let me know in the comments down below. That said, thank you so much for watching. Also, remember to check out my Patreon. I have many cool benefits for you, such as early and ad-free access to my videos. First class patrons also just received their Christmas gift this year, an actual part of a chat engine. If you'd like to support the channel and get these benefits, check out the pinned comment down below. Thank you so much, and see you all in the next one.